Good morning, everyone. Welcome to SmartKnowledgeU Podcast number 6, Deciphering the Language of Lies. I'm not actually sure how long this podcast is going to be. It's probably going to be one of my shorter podcasts, but that does not mean it is not important, because I think it's one of the most critical and important topics I have addressed in my very young podcast series to date. Today's SmartKnowledgeU Podcast is brought to you by Audible.com, where you can download over 150,000 titles for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, and MP3 player. You can get a free audiobook download and 30-day free trial by visiting www.audibletrial.com/SmartKnowledgeU. And usually I recommend a particular audio book about the topic of my podcast, but I'm not really familiar with one off the top of my head that I've read and think is outstanding. So you can merely go to audibletrial.com/SmartKnowledgeU and download any audio book you want for free at that address. So again, if you want to support me, you can go to lulu.com, Lulu.com, and buy my book, The Golden Gift. And in that book, The Golden Gift, I address a lot of the topics that I've been discussing in this podcast series. Okay, let's get started. Well, what do I mean by deciphering the language of lies? I think today that a lot of the world's leaders, in the form of bankers and politicians that are at the top of the pyramid and top of the food chain, have been using language very deceptively against us to make the truth opaque, to confuse us, and to keep us passive. Because very rarely, if ever, is there a failure of regulators, a failure of central bankers, a failure of commercial bankers, failures on the war on drugs, failures in military wars, etc., etc. Although we always will read in the mass media the failure of all these institutions, the people I just named. And why I say there's no failures, because all of these institutions and people execute plans and achieve exactly what they intend to accomplish. And history tells us this. So when people say the central bankers failed miserably to achieve price stability or to achieve maximum employment in the economy, I don't care if they put that as their mission on their website. That is ridiculous for people to fall victim to this. And it's a very, very dangerous way and manner in which to discuss the situations that exist today, because it implies that central bankers intended to achieve price stability and to achieve maximum employment of the labor force when they never intended to do so. So when we speak of, in addition, a failure of capitalism or a failure of gold standard, I'll get into this later, but you can't say something that never existed fails, which is also how the bankers and politicians manipulate language to keep us embedded and invested in believing these lies. So we need to stop saying there is failure, because it's entirely deceptive and counterproductive to ensuring that the truth grows roots and spreads to the maximum amount of people. A lot of people unintentionally participate in masking the truth as well when they talk about the failure of central bankers, the failure of the war on drugs, etc., etc., etc. Because when people listen to these conversations or read the articles online or watch these YouTube videos or listen to podcasts, when they say that these various entities or institutions failed, they believe that these people were actually trying to accomplish something good, and therefore they give credence to the very false possibility that the solution could lie within these same people and institutions, when it unequivocally does not. So that is why we need to start saying central bankers have achieved great success and achieved exactly what they intended to achieve. We need to start saying regulators, the banks, whether it's FINRA in the UK, I believe that's the name of the organization, FINRA, or the CFTC or the SEC in the US, have achieved exactly what they intended to achieve. Because, for example, let me tell you about a regulator, which is basically just a cheerleader for these bankers, in the form of a CFTC investigation into JP Morgan silver manipulation that was conducted between 2009 and 2013. So for 5 years, they were able to quell people's anger, people's frustration, people's disappointment people's misery that was a direct result of JP Morgan manipulating silver prices lower. And they kept people at bay for 5 years by saying, oh, we're still investigating, and don't worry, we're not going to close this investigation. We're very close to getting all the information we need to bring some justice to this situation. And then, you know what happened, of course, after 5 years? There was no real sustainable and positive change because they closed the investigation by concluding that JP Morgan committed no crime, and then the lead investigators, Gary Gensler, who was an ex Goldman Sachs guy, and Bart Chilton, who was just on one of the CFTC commissioners that was at the forefront of the silver investigation, both retired in 2013 with absolutely nothing achieved. So that's exactly what the regulators at the CFTC wanted to achieve, because they're firmly on the side of the criminal bankers. And if we say the regulators at the CFTC were supremely successful in their JP Morgan silver manipulation price investigation, that way people would realize that there's absolutely no hope, no credence to placing any faith in these people, that they will bring about real, sustainable, and positive change. And perhaps then, if we frame these investigations in these terms instead of saying, oh, the regulators at the CFTC failed, because unequivocally they did not fail to achieve their objective, in my mind, because their objective was just keeping people at bay for 5 years while trying to bring no justice to the situation. So they were very successful. Then people will finally understand that real, sustainable, and positive change can only come from working outside our current system and not from trying to work in the already totally broken, rotten, corrupt system of zero utility to the people that exists right now. So once we all realize this, then we can truly begin to effect real, positive, and sustainable change. But as long as we continue framing these as failures of regulators, failures of central bankers, I guarantee you that we are not going to bring about real change, because we're still going to put faith in the fact that change can come from inside the system. And even back then, I remember in 2009 when Gary Gensler was appointed by Barack Obama as the new CFTC commissioner, that Ted Butler, God bless his soul, has done a lot of great work in uncovering the manipulation of silver prices by JP Morgan bankers, expressed his faith. I couldn't believe that, though. Expressed his faith that Gary Gensler would bring about real change, because he released a statement. Gary Gensler released a statement at at the CFTC at some press conference in, I believe it was July of 2009, because I think that's when he was appointed as a new CFTC head of the CFTC, saying that he was going to bring about transparency to the CFTC. He was going to look into limiting all the establishing position limits for commodities, and he was going to bring about transparency, get rid of the corruption, and of course he didn't do anything. So even someone as intelligent as Ted Butler could be totally duped into believing that change can come from within the system, because we promote this false belief that these are all mistakes being made by regulators or failures of the regulators, when they are not mistakes and failures. I can't emphasize that anymore, the importance of the fact that these are not failures, these are not mistakes. These institutions and people are achieving exactly what they intend to achieve. So I hope that all of you, in discussing world politics and finance with your friends, expunge the word failure, expunge the word mistake from your vocabulary, and start talking about the great successes that our leaders are having today. Because indeed, they are a great success from the vantage point of the people that are executing them. So hopefully, going forward, I know it's hard to change old habits, especially since the mass media contributes to this false idea that mistakes are being made and that regulators have failed to do their duty to the public. Hopefully, we will not make the same mistake of using these words anymore. And just because prominent people, again, that are are at the forefront of banking, the forefront of politics, use the word mistake to describe their own actions in hindsight and retrospect, we should not fall into the trap of acknowledging that lie. For example, former Fed Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan testified before U.S. Congress during the 2008 global economic crisis that he had made, quote unquote, a mistake in his hands-off regulatory philosophy. And he said he now blamed his mistake for sparking the global economic troubles. So let me read you something that he said during his congressional testimony. He said, quote, "Those of us who have looked to the self-interest of lending institutions to protect shareholders' equity, myself especially, are in a state of shocked disbelief." Do I believe that statement? When he conceded that he, quote unquote, found a flaw in his thinking and that he was, quote unquote, distressed by that? I don't buy that for 1 second. I think that any of us that do buy that explanation are extremely naive and gullible. Because he also mentioned that no regulator was smart enough to foresee the quote-unquote once-in-a-century credit tsunami that happened in 2008. That is entirely garbage and rubbish, because many people back then, if you check the blogosphere at that time, including yours truly, predicted that tsunami that Greenspan said was unpredictable. And it had nothing to do, I guarantee you, with being smart. You can even go back to my blog again. You can find on my website at www.smartknowledgeu.com, and you can see I predicted the U.S. stock market crash that happened in 2008, 18 business days, trading days before it happened. How did I do that? It just had to do with being grounded in reality and facts and not buying into the lies of people like Greenspan. So Greenspan, in my eyes, he never made any mistakes. He accomplished exactly what he was trying to accomplish, because his job was basically to make his masters richer at the expense of all Americans if necessary. And that's exactly what he did. Because back then, when he was Fed Reserve Chairman, there were plenty of people unofficially, like outside that official government realm, that warned him. But there was actually one very prominent person who I would consider to be the last honest person in the CFTC, who was the CFTC chair, Brooksley born. I believe this was as far back as 1990. He warned Brooksley born is a woman. She warned Greenspan of the disastrous consequences that would result from his policies. So a former top official at the CFTC that worked closely with Bourne, Michael Greenberger, said, quote, "I walk into Brooksley's office one day, the blood has drained from her face. She's hanging up the telephone. She says to me, 'That was former Assistant Treasury Secretary Larry Summers. He says you're going to cause the worst financial crisis since the end of World War II. He says he has 13 bankers in his office who informed him of this. Stop, right away, no more,' end quote." So what was Brooksley Born trying to do? Brooksley Born warned the Fed Reserve to regulate derivatives, and that the unregulated derivative markets would cause massive price distortion and eventually result in the 2008 economic market crashes that happened all over the world, and she was entirely right. Although Greenspan, Robert Rubin, who is a former Citibank executive, and Larry Summers, former Harvard president and also a Citibank executive, ultimately prevailed and stopped Bourne and forced her resignation. So again, the history and the facts are just there for anyone to see, that these guys are accomplishing exactly what they're trying to accomplish. They have plenty of warnings to stop doing what they're doing, and they don't. You know, some people will say, oh, we can't be sure that Greenspan intended to enrich bankers and bankrupt Main Street Americans with his policies, and that it was just his arrogance that caused him to ignore Brooksley Born's warnings to him, that he was creating a future economic disaster. But I contend that this assertion that it was just Greenspan's arrogance that caused him to ignore Bourne's warning is ludicrous. Because if you research the history of the U.S. Fed Reserve, and a good place to start is with G. Edward Griffin's seminal book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, that describes the founding bankers of the privately run U.S. Federal Reserve, you'll discover that we literally, not figuratively, literally have 100 years of documented Fed Reserve banker criminal activity. So I'm sure all of you have heard of that saying, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. Well, how about being fooled for 100 years, consecutive years in a row? Because we have 100 years of evidence of Fed Reserve banker criminal activity, and we have been fooled not once, not twice, but hundreds of times since then, because all their actions they took in 2008, which Greenspan said he didn't know was going to happen and was a mistake, you can see that repeated in 100 years of history of central banking. And it's just not the Fed Reserves, it's the Bank of England bankers and all other central banks around the world. So we have 100 years of history, not just of one central bank, but of many central banks committing the same criminal acts and coming back years later and saying, oh, it's a mistake. So then people are fooled into believing that the solution can come from within. So we got to stop framing these disasters in history as a mistake, because they aren't. They're deliberate, they're carefully plotted, and you can see they have the same blueprint. They use the blueprint over and over again. So it is just naivete, gullibility, and our unwillingness to uncover the truth, because they're in history. We should never believe that any of this is a mistake. And as an example, just think about this, as an example of the morally bankrupt people we have leading us today, whether it's at the heights of the finance industry or the heights of politics, just think about this statement. We have never had a war-free time during our lifetime where there was not a single war, not even just one war, but not multiple wars somewhere in the world. Think about that. The leaders that run the world are so crazy that we have not had a single day of peace because of the fact that there have always been multiple wars in the world since the day every one of us has been born. That is crazy, or at least my generation. So that is entirely crazy. That's insane. I bet you like a lot of you have never thought about that, but that is insanity. That shows you the immorality and the moral bankruptcy of the people that are leading our world today. So we need to start acknowledging the truth that these people are achieving great successes in their policies. We need to stop acknowledging any of these leaders that say they committed mistakes, because it simply is not true. As they have achieved what they intended, we need to stop using the word failure when it comes to the economic disasters our leaders have achieved and our bankers have achieved. And only when we do this can we spread the truth, because it's too confusing to others when we talk about the failures and the mistakes of bankers and politicians. So, furthermore, let me discuss how our leaders have become very, very, very clever architects of language and how they twist words to deceive us and keep us passive. So it is literally up to us to disengage from the linguistic framework, which is a very deceptive framework in which they try to frame economic disaster, political disaster, and wars are going on today. So we have to just deconstruct their deceptive tactics. And let me explain exactly what I mean by that. I'm sure that people listening to this podcast will call me out for speaking about the failure of the war on drugs or the failure of capitalism in one or two, or actually probably even more, of my older videos or blog postings, because I've been posting blog articles since 2006 and videos, I'm not really sure, but I think for at least 6 or 7 or 8 years now. So I am sure I have fallen victim to this whole game of language of lies that bankers and politicians have cleverly ensnared us in and gotten our willing participation as well. But this was wrong of me in the past, and I want to correct not only myself but all others that participate in the bankers and politicians' language of lies and inadvertently help promote their propaganda and inadvertently help obscure the truth about their actions when we do this. So if we look at like the war on drugs, the only people besides drug lords that really make a lot of profit from the war on drugs are bankers and politicians. So the war on drugs is designed to channel billions of dollars of profits into the pockets of bankers and politicians, and that is exactly what it achieves. It is extremely profitable And that's why there's such a difficult time making illegal drugs. I think they're class 1 narcotics. Is that the proper term? I'm not really sure. But, you know, there's different classes of narcotics, and the highest level, like cocaine, heroin, they'll never be legalized because it's too profitable to the elite, the wealthy sectors of society that make billions of dollars off this drug trade to make it legal, because their billions of dollars of profit will go away. And prohibition in America showed us that, because what happened when alcohol was made illegal in the 1920s? I'm not really sure the exact date, but somewhere in the early 1900s when prohibition was around. Of course, the bootleggers were the mafia, right? So you see the criminal elements that controlled the illegal alcohol distribution are the same criminal elements like the bankers, the politicians, the drug lords that profit from the war on drugs. So when the war on drugs enriches the exact segments of the population it's intended to enrich, you can't say the war on drugs is a failure. It's extremely successful to those who are conducting the false war on drugs. And so this is how we need to start looking at things. And let me conclude this podcast by talking about the way bankers and politicians have also twisted linguistics to further propel lies. Because I'm sure a lot of you during the 2008 global economic crash heard about Ben Bernanke saying how capitalism failed, and other global leaders repeatedly state this, how capitalism failed. And they even drew in activists. They drew in a lot of activists at that time who kept saying, we need to abolish capitalism because capitalism failed. So, and I'm sure you've heard the same thing from, it was Fed Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan that said, oh, we didn't have enough regulation and free markets failed. And that's why we had the 2008 global economic collapse. And then I'm sure you've heard a lot of economists like Nouriel Roubini at New York University. I believe Paul Krugman has also said, I'm not positive, but I know Nouriel Roubini has criticized the gold standard, said we can't return to a gold standard because many economic crashes happen to that. Well, you cannot blame something like capitalism, free markets, and the gold standard for economic crashes when they never existed. They never existed. So you can't blame something that does not exist for failure. And that's what all these people are doing and promoting a false narrative. What do I mean by that? Well, first of all, we don't have any capitalism anywhere in the world today because the very pillar of capitalism is free markets. And if you have central banks, and I believe there's only 3 countries in the world that don't have central banks right now. North Korea, is it Iran? And I think one other country. I don't know if I'm getting this countries right, but I do believe it's 3 or 4 countries in the world that don't have central banks. So every other country in the world has a central bank. What are these central bankers doing? They are artificially, deliberately setting interest rates. What's a free market? A free market is a market in which the market sets interest rates. So if you have a central bank setting interest rates, by definition, you cannot have a free market. Free markets and central banks cannot coexist at the same time. If you don't have free markets, there's no capitalism. So how are we blaming capitalism and free markets for the global economic collapse in 2008? And when I go back to Roubini, that also falsely blamed the gold standard for economic crashes that happened, he goes back to periods when like say Bretton Woods, when the gold standard was fixed at, I believe it was $35 an ounce. So a true gold, if you really want to know what a true gold standard is, I don't have the time because it would probably take me an hour in this podcast to go into it, but I am going to be releasing a smart wealth education program soon, and probably will be giving away some free memberships to that as well, as I always do when I launch a new product. And I go into great detail about what the difference is between a true gold standard and a partial or pseudo gold standard. So all these times these economists and central bankers blame economic failures during gold standard, I prove that there was no gold standard that existed during that time, not a true one anyways. And so unless you have a true gold standard in place, you can't blame a gold standard for any economic failures that happened during that period. So again, I think that basically is going to wrap up my podcast for today. Again, if you basically were able to extract anything from this, if you learned anything from this, please do pass the podcast on to other people. Again, we'll put the downloadable MP3 on the iTunes podcast so you can find it there. Please do spread the word to other people, and please do comment below, because comments do help the podcast get more views. So I'll put some other, I'm not really sure what, because I was just doing this podcast off the top of my head, I'm not really sure what kind of references I'm going to put in the YouTube video description. I will put some references there so you can further investigate for yourself the topic I discussed today. So as always, remain intensely curious, and until next time, so long and have a great day.